Hello, pattern readers. I have another video I promised you in my How to Adapt series. Previously, I tackled how to adapt the romances in the Wheel of Time books from page to screen. But I saved this one complicated romance for a separate video because there's so much to say about it. I also got quite a range of opinions from other fans when I raised this topic in that previous video. So something is going to change here, but it's not exactly clear how. First things first, this video will contain book spoilers. The majority of what I'm talking about is pretty well established by Book 7, A Crown of Swords, but there will be a few specific spoilers for books beyond that. I will put spoiler tags in the description for anything that goes beyond Book 7, so if you need to, you can hover over the progress bar to check those. So let's dive into the most prominent poly relationship in the books, Rand and the Three. Min, Aviendha, and Elayne. So to do that, I want to start by talking about the challenges this relationship presents to adaptation. And that will include talking about what doesn't quite land in the books, as well as what might not work well for a modern streaming audience. Second, I'm going to talk about what does work well in the books and which aspects might be important to include for the basic structure of the story. And then finally, I'll go through two broad possibilities for how I think this relationship could be adapted for the show. And for each one, I'll give what I see as its pros and cons. I think either one could work, but it depends on the priorities and the vision of the creative team. I think the most succinct way to sum up one of the big issues with the way the poly relationship is written in the books is to say that it's unevenly developed. Now, parts of it are given enough time to be believable, and I think parts of it are not. People are going to have different opinions about which characters within this larger group they enjoy most together, but it's hard to argue that Elayne and Rand are given enough time for their development. They have a meet cute in book 1. They don't meet again really until book 4. And then however brief that interaction is, it's really the most sustained amount of time they have together. And they separate in confusion and don't meet again until book 9. And then again, another absence. So no matter how much time they spend thinking about each other in between, their overall development is lacking. And there is a similar problem with Aviendha after book 5 because she and Rand end up spending so much time apart. In the books, the women all agree to be romantically involved with Rand and to be friends with each other. This makes the friendships among the women just as important to get right. And yet, Man and Aviendha spend hardly any time together. It's really just their mutual friendship with Elayne and Min's viewing that allows them to accept each other. But given that they're virtual strangers, this acceptance does stretch believability. The other issue is the nature of the relationship itself. There's the optics of imbalance and of fulfilling a male fantasy when you have 3 women in a romantic relationship with 1 man. Robert Jordan worked hard to combat this by making it very clear that the women were the ones doing the choosing and making Rand be the one who needed to be convinced. But he also makes it clear that it wasn't what any of them thought they wanted. The pattern being involved in bringing them all together makes this attempt at maintaining agency for all of them a little weaker. And the fact is, it is still centered on Rand. We also have to consider that this story was started over 30 years ago. And consensual polyamorous relationships probably do have more acceptance now than they had in the 1990s. But we also have more open discussion on the male gaze, the politics of gender, and a lot more that will make achieving the right balance and portraying a healthy poly relationship challenging for a modern audience. So what are the essentials of these relationships in the books? What are the highlights? What are the parts that have a most significant impact on major plot points? For me, I think the parts that get the best development are Rand with Min and Elayne with Aviendha. I know not everyone is sold on Rand and Min, and I don't speak for everyone. And this also is not intended to be a video talking about the importance of Min. I've already done a video on that, so please check that out if you're someone who questions the importance of Min's role in the story. But I think it's hard to argue that Rand and Min don't at least get enough time together to make their relationship more believable. One thing I will say is that the veins of gold moment, when the group becomes bonded and he realizes the feelings that all 3 have for him, is both a beautiful moment and hugely impactful later in the story. I think that Rand would not have been able to have his epiphany on Dragonmount, and he would have failed if he had not had sure knowledge of that love. Min's role here is especially crucial because she has been able to stay with him. Her love for him feels stronger to him and is easier for him to remember in that key moment. I also find the relationship between Elayne and Aviendha beautifully developed, and they're given plenty of time together to make that believable. In the books, it's a sister dynamic. They literally adopt each other as sisters, so it's not romantic. However, there's enough there that I think if the show chose to have a romantic relationship between them, it would not be hard to develop. That doesn't mean that it would automatically be better. The relationship that they have as friends and sisters is just as real and meaningful. But I would not find it a stretch to change the dynamic to romantic, assuming they took out the part where they adopt each other so it doesn't become incesty. I also find the setup and falling in love phase of Rand and Aviendha's relationship to be very well done. It is tied in well with his learning about the Aiel and his heritage. And they get a solid 2 books together, and their relationship is really tied into the climax of book 5. Lanfear confronts Rand over his relationship with Aviendha, and it leads directly to Moiraine taking Lanfear out and then both falling through the doorway to the Finns. This is a huge moment that the show will absolutely include. So they would have to really carefully consider before making any changes to Rand and Aviendha's dynamic, since it is directly related to this moment. Before I move on to possible ways to adapt the relationship, I want to mention the ways the book tries to make the case for why it was necessary for all 3 of these women to be in love with and together with Rand at the same time. First of all, because of Min's viewing, we understand there was pattern involvement in bringing all of them together and giving them the opportunity to fall in love. I believe they had that potential within themselves already, but the pattern created the opportunity. I believe this to be because Rand, as a Taviran, needed something from all 3 of them. What it was he needed is open for debate, but the popular opinion seemed to be that he learned leadership skills and how to run a country from Elayne. He built his understanding of and connection to the Aiel through Aviendha, and Min was involved in helping Rand understand prophecies and whom he could trust. You might question why he needed to be in love with them to learn these things from them. And the only answer I can give is that the fact that his trust was in such short supply is probably the reason. But there's nothing in that really explains why he needed to be in love with all 3 of them and together with all 3 of them at the same time. I think that came about because Robert Jordan was also interested in referencing triple goddess mythology. If you're not familiar with that, check the description for a link. If we break it down this way, I think we can see that there are reasons why it was written the way it was. But we shouldn't discount the possibility that there are alternative ways to accomplish the same ideas. So do we have anything to go on to predict what the show might already be planning? Well, we have this Twitter exchange with Rafe Judkins from September 2018. He was asked, will Rand's romance plot remain close to the books? At first, he just said no. And then he followed up to clarify, let's just say I'm more interested in polyamory than polygamy. This still leaves a lot of questions, but it does give us some indication of the direction he might be headed in. But let's first explore the possibility that these relationships need not be poly. Perhaps Rafe was referring to other relationships when he mentioned polyamory in the show, and Rand could have a series of sequential monogamous relationships. To explore this idea, I think we should start by breaking it down roughly by season for the first few seasons to see where the pieces might fit in. In season 1, we shouldn't forget that before any of these women were a love interest for Rand, Egwene actually came first, and I don't think the show is going to overlook this. If anything, I think it might make sense to strengthen that connection and have them as a more established couple at the beginning. In the books, by the time we get to their sort of official breakup, it's something we've seen coming miles away, and I don't think we're expected to have a really strong emotional reaction to it because Robert Jordan paired it with Elayne making a move on Rand. I think it would make sense to separate a breakup with Egwene from the beginning of any other attachment, and to make the moment more bittersweet so it has a bigger impact. I think a breakup could occur at the end of season 1, or it could be pushed to sometime in season 2. We know we meet Min in season 1, and from the information we have on when the actress Kai Alexander started filming, we can guess that we might not meet her until the group arrives in Faldara in episode 7. There should be enough time there to start building a connection with Rand, but it's not likely to be romantic yet. We don't have any official casting for Elayne, so we have to consider the possibility that her meeting with Rand in Caemlyn is skipped. If this is the case, I think it will be even a little harder to sell them as a couple when they eventually do meet. But I can also understand why introducing too many potential future love interests in a season when he's still attached to Egwene also doesn't work very well. Season 2 would be where Selene/Lanfear likely comes into play. I'm going to note here that the show is going to have an issue with Rand being the guy that every young, attractive woman throws herself at. So with that in mind, it makes sense to cut extraneous characters who have crushes on him, like Els Grinwell. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of opportunity to add a Rand and Elayne connection here in season 2 if we're talking about the plots of The Great Hunt and The Dragon Reborn. As I'm going to detail in another video, I think the end of season 2 should end with the fall of the Stone of Tyr, which would mean if they decide to keep, I'm going to call it a fling, between Rand and Elayne, this could probably occur at the beginning of season 3. The problem is that I think season 3 also needs to be the season of Aviendha. I think that's going to be the big Aiel season that will likely end with the climax of the Fires of Heaven, as I went over in my Moiraine video. So I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to try to fit in a fling with Elayne in the same season that he also has a love affair with Aviendha. It's one thing to just start establishing a connection between them, but in this scenario, we're talking about sequential relationships, and there just isn't going to be time for much, especially without a lot of setup. It's possible for him to still be learning some strategy from her without it being overtly romantic. It's also possible that he could be learning that from a different character, and that interaction could be cut altogether. So what would happen if Rand and Elayne's relationship was removed completely? The main thing it would impact is actually Aviendha and Rand, because she wouldn't have that reason for resisting her feelings for Rand. She'd have to be given a different motivation to want to quash those feelings, which I think could be done. They would also probably end up cutting Elayne's pregnancy, but to be honest, I don't think that was ever really a necessary plot element. The question of Elayne's heirs isn't one the show really has to address because it's pretty much outside the scope of the story. I think there isn't a major barrier, but there's probably still people who would miss this relationship. Is it possible that a relationship between them could be fit in at a different point in the story? I mean, certainly, but it's very hard for me to speculate on what that would be without knowing more details about how things would be structured. I should also note that in this scenario, Rand and Aviendha would split when the story takes them in different directions, likely somewhere in season 4, leaving him open for a relationship to develop with Min. So would there be any consequences of ending his relationship with Aviendha early? The main one that comes to mind is when Aviendha sees a possible Aiel future through the eyes of her descendants and Rand's when she goes backwards through the glass column ter'angreal in Rhuidean. But I think there are other ways that that scene could be handled. I don't think they would have to cut it. So again, it doesn't seem like a major barrier. I should also note that it would still be possible for Rand to bond Min if he is the one forming the weave. So they could still have the Veins of Gold moment and the Epiphany on Dragonmount. The other possibility left open in this scenario is for a romantic relationship to then develop between Aviendha and Elayne. There are a lot of fans who see this potential, and there's certainly some advantages to perhaps going in this direction, which again, their existing relationship is very well done, but there are other opportunities to potentially explore here. And the other thing is, I don't think the first sister adoption ceremony is likely to make it into the show. And there's likely to be other first sister relationships, so that element would not be gone completely. So the pros to this sequential relationship scenario is that it's relatively simple and it focuses on the aspects of the books that already work best while dropping those that are less effective. It also does away with the optics of male fantasy fulfillment. The cons are that it drops the triple goddess mythology from the books, and it shies away from providing a balanced, positive example of a poly relationship. So it also doesn't fit as well with what Rafe Judkins has said. Now let's talk about how they should adapt the relationship if they want to go in the direction of polyamory. I want to right up front address a concern raised by Lesbi Nerdy when she talked about this poly relationship. She talked about how writing it so that the women are also in a romantic relationship with each other does not automatically address the criticism of male fantasy fulfillment. For men who have this fantasy, the idea that the women would also want to have sex with each other is not really a turnoff. Quite the opposite, really. So while it does keep Rand from being the central focus of it all and potentially allow the whole thing to be more balanced, it might still end up catering to the male gaze. So with that in mind, I think there are a couple of things the show can do to be mindful of this. First of all, when there are scenes of all four of them together, they're going to want to keep it more focused on romance than sex. It could be more sweet than sultry, and they should be mindful of adding scenes that might be mainly for titillation. Secondly, they can also present a polyamorous romance with multiple men. And the one that springs immediately to mind, and in fact, I think we will see starting in season 1, is Alanna Sedai and her 2 warders. Now let's talk about how this relationship could be developed and sequenced. I think season 1 would probably play out pretty much the same as I talked about in the first scenario. In season 2, however, we could start to see a romantic connection developing between Min and Elayne when they're both in the White Tower. The story would eventually separate them if Min is in the tower during the coup and Elayne is not. But their dynamic could be established, and it would allow them to part amicably when they end up needed in different places. I think season 3 would also play out pretty much the same as I'd previously discussed, but in this scenario, I think it would make sense to keep the interaction between Elayne and Rand in the Stone of Tyr so that we could at least see that they're attracted to each other and a connection is starting to form. I think Rand and Aviendha would still fall in love in season 3. She would probably still need a different motivation for resisting her feelings for Rand. And when it comes time for them to part, they would do so without really an expectation of a future, but they'd still have mutual feelings. This leaves Rand and Min open to falling in love when the story brings them together in season 4. And in this scenario, Elayne and Aviendha would also fall in love once they reunite and spend more time together. The trick then is in bringing all 4 of them together at some point. But by then, we would have already seen most of the permutations of these couples within the larger group falling in love. It would help if we had had Min and Aviendha meet at any point previously. I wonder if there's a possibility of having Aviendha still be in Camelin when Min arrives instead of missing her. Or the other possibility is if Min ends up in the Stone of Tyr, then all 4 of them are actually together in the same place. But either way, there's already a lot more love connections established in this scenario, and it then becomes a choice of them all choosing to love and bond each other instead of the focus being on Rand and on sharing him. The pros here are mainly about the change in focus and balance, so it's less centered on Rand. And there might need to be some more use of traveling to bring the 4 together at some point to help with the aspects that are less well developed. But they're also not necessarily asking us to believe that Rand and Elayne are fully in love after a brief dalliance and a long separation. Rather that they're open to each other, and more so because of their mutual love for Min and Aviendha. There could be a similar connection between Min and Aviendha if they can bond at all over their mutual love of Rand and Elayne. This option also maintains and expands upon the aspects of the books that did work well, and it achieves the polyamory element that Rafe said he was interested in. The cons are that it is more complicated, and it still would probably leave some aspects of it less well developed than others. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Which of these 2 scenarios do you think would work better and why? Or maybe you have another idea altogether. Make sure to subscribe for more on how to adapt the Wheel of Time. And until next time, gird your loins, my friends.